Hello everyone. Today's episode of Tinkering with Terrius is going to be a bit different. Instead of an electronics video here, we're going to do a baking video. So today I'm going to show you how to make a sourdough starter. So my method for making sourdough starter does require the use of a kitchen scale, whether it's an analog scale or a digital scale, that's up to you. Now the reason I use a kitchen scale is to make sure that I maintain my sourdough starter at as close to 100% hydration as possible. And that just means there's an equal amount of flour and water in the starter. In addition to the scale, you'll probably want a large tub or container to hold the flour once we've mixed it. So before we actually start the sourdough starter, what we're going to want to do is to measure out about a week's worth of flour. So for me that's about 800 grams or about 28 ounces. This is going to be a mixture of half unbleached white flour, 1/4 whole wheat flour, and 1/4 rye flour. So first up we'll add the whole wheat flour. Now we'll add the rye flour. These flours are much heavier than just regular white flour because they contain the bran and all of the other goodness. Now I find that this combination of flours works ideally for me. However, you can basically use any combination that you desire. Adding whole wheat and rye to the initial starter helps to kickstart the bacteria development by adding additional nutrients that you don't get out of just the plain white flour. The most important thing is that you use unbleached white flour, as bleached flour will have additional additives and oxidants in it that will be detrimental to the yeast and to the lactic bacteria that we're trying to grow. It's important to make sure the flour is very well mixed. I'll usually mix it first with a spatula and then shake it vigorously with the lid closed on the container. This just ensures that it's a relatively even mix of flours. Now that we have the flour measured, we need a container to start our starter in, and I recommend using a clear glass canning jar. It's also important to weigh your jar before you use it, and I like to make a note on the jar itself with the initial weight using a Sharpie marker. Next we're going to zero out the scale with the jar on it. To the empty jar we are going to add 40 grams or about 1.5 ounces of pre-mixed flour. Then we'll add an equal amount of water, roughly 40 grams or about 1.5 ounces. Personally, I used bottled water, however you can use regular tap water. If you are using regular tap water, I would recommend setting it out in a container on the counter overnight. This just allows the chlorine to dissipate from the water. Chlorine, of course, will be detrimental to the yeast and other bacteria, so we want to minimize the amount of detrimental things as much as possible. Now we need to stir the mixture together very well, making sure that there is no unhydrated flour. This is also a time where you're kind of building up a little bit of gluten in the starter, just to help trap the air bubbles to make it easier to see if it's rising. Finally, we're going to cover the jar. For this, I just use a half sheet of paper towel folded over and a canning jar ring to secure it. Then you need to set it aside in a warm spot for 24 hours. Ideally, you want the temperature of the spot to be between 21 and 26 degrees Celsius or 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. This time-lapse clip here is of the first 24 hours of activity in the starter. You'll notice that over the course of the day, the top of the starter starts to darken and form a crust. This is normal, there's nothing to worry about here, but you can reduce it by using plastic wrap with small holes poked into it rather than paper towels as the lid. Now that it has been 24 hours, we need to feed the starter. So first we're going to weigh the jar, and we want to discard all but 40 grams or 1.5 ounces of the starter from the night before. This is the primary reason we weighed the jar and marked its weight on the jar. At every feeding from here on out, you will want to keep 40 grams of the original starter, and you'll be adding 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. However, unlike the first day where we created the starter and added the flour first, from now on you want to add the water first. This is just to allow the original starter to dissolve a bit better and makes it easier to blend throughout the new flour. It's also very good practice to scrape down the sides of the jar as best as you can, as the buildup of dried starter will slowly add to the weight of the jar and throw off your measurements slightly. For the next few days, usually 3 or 4, we will continue to feed the starter once every 24 hours. Now this primarily depends on the temperature of the room that the starter is being kept in. If it's a warmer room, you might find that you only need 1 or 2 days of the 24-hour feedings, but once those are over, we're going to transition to every 12 hours. Now don't get discouraged if you have no activity in your starter for the first week to 10 days, and also do not get discouraged if you have an initial huge burst of activity and then the starter goes flat. These are all normal things. The huge burst of activity is usually the incorrect type of yeast. These are just the opportunistic yeasts that will not survive in the acidic environment that we will be creating. As long as tiny bubbles are still appearing in the starter and it doesn't smell foul or rancid, your starter's probably fine. The most important thing you can do is every day before you feed your starter, take a nice big smell of it. Smell is really going to be your single easiest tool for determining how the starter is maturing. Ideally, we're looking for a smell kind of reminiscent of overly ripe fruit, possibly with a slight inkiness to it initially. Once the starter starts getting stronger, there are many different stages and smells that it will go through, ranging from fruity to vinegary to alcoholic. Ideally, we want to keep the starter in the fruity to vinegary range, but allowing it to pass into the alcohol phase won't drastically affect it, just as long as you maintain a consistent feeding schedule. If you're noticing that it is passing from fruity to alcoholic very quickly, or it's starting to form a thick layer of hooch on top, which is a layer of liquid that smells very strongly of alcohol, then you'll want to increase your feeding frequency or decrease the room temperature that you're storing it in. In fact, once your starter is fully active, you can even store it in the fridge and reduce feedings to once per week. If you choose to refrigerate your starter though, be sure to take it out of the fridge 24 to 48 hours before you plan to make bread with it. And of course, resume the 12-hour feeding schedule in order to kind of wake up and strengthen the starter and get it ready for bread. With all the time it takes to actually make a sourdough starter, it's reassuring to know that it's pretty difficult to outright kill it. Most starters can easily recover from extended periods of neglect. As long as there is no mold running through the starter, you should be able to simply discard some of the top of it and resume feeding it normally. The yeast and the acid-producing bacteria are very resilient, and they create an environment that's very difficult for bad bacteria to grow in due to the acidity. As a fail-safe, I actually recommend that you dry some of your sourdough starter and keep it in an airtight container in the freezer. This simply prevents having to start over at day 1 should you accidentally kill your starter in some way. You'll want to increase the size of the feeding the night before you plan on drying starter if you want to dry some out. I added 100 grams of both water and flour to bring the total of my starter up to 240 grams. In the morning for the feeding, instead of adding both flour and water, we're just going to add flour. I added about 60 grams of flour mix, though some of it didn't incorporate. This is to reduce the hydration level in the starter and just make it a little bit easier and take a little less time to dry out. You will then want to line a baking sheet with parchment or wax paper and spread the starter as thinly over the paper as possible. When you're done spreading it, you'll want to move it to a warm, dry location. I find that an oven with the oven light on works perfectly for this. After a few hours, you should check the starter and see if the top has become crusty and dried out. If it has and the bottom still remains very wet, you can scrape the starter off the paper and flip it over to expose the wet parts to the dry air. Mine took about 24 hours, and then I used a coffee grinder to turn it into a semi-fine powder. The reason to grind it like this is just to make rehydrating it easier in the future. In the end, my 300 grams of starter turned into 155 grams of powder, and the bonus is, now I don't have to worry about starting over from scratch again. I hope you found this episode of Baking with Terrius interesting. I'm hoping it will be the first of many episodes in this little series. If you did find it interesting, then please definitely give it a like and share it with your friends. If you know anybody that's interested in baking with sourdough starter but doesn't know where to start, hopefully this video will help them out. It's a very simple process for a very delicious form of bread. Personally, I love sourdough bread. I would much rather have sourdough bread than regular white bread or regular whole wheat bread, just because of the depth of flavor the sourdough starter adds to it. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, then please definitely leave them in the section below, or email them to me or tweet them to me. If you're interested in seeing more of these Baking with Terrius episodes or my electronics videos, then be sure to subscribe to my channel. And if you haven't, then hit the little bell icon to get notifications whenever I post a new video. We recently hit 100 subscribers, so that's amazing. I never expected to get that far. So now the channel has its own unique URL. And I just wanted to say thank you to all you guys. You are all amazing, all my viewers, all my subscribers. I couldn't have gotten this far without you guys. You're awesome. So thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.